lecture is about non-standard varieties of English, or varieties of English pronounced in a different way from the standard that we have been normally teaching you, about Cockney and Estuary English. This is what we're surrounded by in London. And let me start by telling you what happened to me this morning as I walked to the station. I was stopped by a young man who wanted to ask me the way to get to a particular road. I knew how to tell him, so I stopped and I explained to him how he should find that road. He wanted to express his gratitude to me, so he said, "Cheers, mate," which is the third of those possibilities on the screen in front of you. Now, if I'd been asking someone the way, I wouldn't have said, "Cheers, mate," at the end. I'd have said, "Thank you," or perhaps less formally, "Thanks a lot," because those are the forms of gratitude that are appropriate for me to utter. If we'd been in Leeds, say, in Yorkshire, and the corresponding situation had arisen, he wouldn't have said, "Cheers, mate." He'd probably have said, "Ta love." So both of those forms, "cheers, mate" and "ta love," are local forms of English, whereas "thank you" or the informal "thanks a lot" are not local in that sense. They're found virtually everywhere where English is spoken. So we've got here differences of geography. We've also got differences of style or register, because within my English I can either say "thank you," which is neutral, or "thanks a lot," which is informal. But we've also got, in Britain, always the class dimension, the social class dimension. Now, since I have to count as a middle or upper middle class person, that explains why I don't normally greet other men with the form "mate." "Mate" is used by working class men when addressing other men. Or by extension, it's used by working class men when addressing any other man. If he had wanted to perhaps emphasize the class difference between us, if he was aware of it, he might have said, "Cheers, Gov." Gov, short for governor, being the form used by London working class men towards those they perceive as being of higher social class. This is what a taxi driver might well call you. "Right, Gov, take you where you want to go." Now, all of this sort of thing adds to the difficulties that those for whom English is not a native language face when they interact with native speakers, who are giving off this kind of signal about regionality, about social class, about formality all the time. And it's in this context that we have to talk about Cockney and about Estuary English. Cockney then is the broadest or most deviant kind of London working class speech. As such, people often say it's associated particularly with the East End of London. To be a true Cockney, you have to be born within the sound of Bow bells. Bow in East London, Bow Church. That's the traditional definition. In practice, we have a kind of continuum between the working class speech of that part of London and the working class speech of many other parts of London, and indeed the non-working class speech. You don't have sharp divisions, you have gradual changes. And a lot of the things we could say about Cockney apply to some extent to an awful lot of different kinds of English. In particular, the ways in which Cockney grammar is non-standard are to be found in popular English in many, many parts of the country. Cockney does have its own special characteristics, such as rhyming slang, which we shall look at in a minute, which other places don't necessarily have. The London working class, though, occupies a very important part in the English language because it seems to be the source of many of the innovations which spread out geographically from London to other parts of the country, other parts of the English-speaking world, and also which spread out socially away from their working class roots into more general kinds of English. When we place London in its geographical position, it is of course in the southeast of England, and London as the capital city particularly dominates all of the southeast of England, to a lesser extent dominates the whole country, the whole United Kingdom, and so tends to have its innovations imitated and picked up by other places. In fact, London pronunciation is very innovative. That is to say, many new developments arise in London working class speech, and in many cases they historically have spread, both geographically and socially, into other forms of English. Now, ever since 1984, people have started to use the expression estuary English as well. So we must talk about estuary English. The claim made by David Rosewarne, who invented the term, is that popular London English is spreading out geographically. Well, that's true. And so he wanted a name, really, that doesn't tie us down geographically to London, but expresses the notion of the whole of the southeast of England. So he referred to the estuary, that's the broad river mouth of the River Thames, London's river, and calls it estuary English, meaning the kind of English that extends from Oxford to Southend, Bedford to Brighton, the whole of the southeast of England. And Rosewarne made the interesting claim in his article in 1984 that estuary English is a new variety. It's intermediate between Cockney at one extreme and received pronunciation standard English at the other extreme, and it's very influential because many people who in a previous generation might have spoken RP no longer speak RP, but they speak with this southeast tinged pronunciation, not broad Cockney, but with certain features of it. And he claims that it's being adopted by more and more people. It's certainly true that when students come to London, perhaps from some other part of the country, they may be under pressure to change their accent. They don't typically change it towards received pronunciation. They typically change it towards this intermediate variety. And indeed, Rosewarne claims that RP is likely to be displaced in due course by estuary English. Now, there are big problems in defining what we mean by estuary English, and indeed many of the explicit claims made by Rosewarne have been shown to be false. I have set up, and I look after, a website about estuary English, and on that website I've collected together a large number of documents relating to estuary English, including various scientific studies. There's an article by Peter Trubgill, who we may have heard of, the sociolinguist. Another one by Paul Kurzweil, another excellent sociolinguist. And there are many other articles there as well, including references, and in some cases the complete text, of MA theses and PhD theses written by people investigating how far the claim is true, for example, that the whole of the southeast speaks in the same way. Now, there was one Polish lady, Alaska, who investigated speech at 4 quadrants, about 30 miles from central London, in 4 different directions, to see if they all speak in the same way, as is claimed by Estuary English. She found they didn't. Those in the south-east had elements of Kentish pronunciation. Those in the southwest had elements of Surrey border pronunciation. Those in the northwest were Hertfordshire, Bedfordshire. Those in the northeast were Essex, which of course is what you traditionally predict. And she lists what these differences are. So the actual claim is not literally true. Nevertheless, it clearly has elements of truth, and it corresponds certainly to a popular perception of what is going on in the changing accent picture in Britain. The term estuary English has therefore been adopted by journalists, by the popular press, and in popular views about language, the term estuary English has now become established. Well, I thought we ought to look at some of the special characteristics of Cockney. One of the most famous things in Cockney is the rhyming slang. Now, rhyming slang is almost a kind of secret language derived from standard vocabulary, but ending up sounding quite different. If we consider the word look, as in to have a look at something. Now, in Cockney, you can say to have a butcher's. Let's have a butcher's. Let's have a look. This is because look rhymes with butcher's hook, which a butcher uses to cut up the meat and so on. You then take this rhyming phrase and shorten it, truncate it. You lose the actual rhyming part. From look, you take butcher's hook. From butcher's hook, you lose hook, and you're left with butchers. And you then use butchers to mean look, have a butcher's. You may know many other examples of the same thing. One of the books that I recommend at the foot of your handout sheet is the British Phrase Book, published by Lonely Planet. Here's an example. I have to say it's an invented example, not really an authentic one, but every element in it is authentic, of Cockney rhyming slang. I don't bleed Adam and Eve in. Adam and Eve believe. Now, that's the long form of rhyming slang, where you have the whole phrase there. Adam and Eve believe. So it means believe. I don't believe it becomes I don't believe Adam and Eve in. I went out to get some Uncle Fred bread, a linen draper, paper, and some oily rags, fags, cigarettes. And when I reached for my sausage and mash, cash, I found the teapot lid, quid, pound, had fallen out of my skyrocket pocket. So now I'm totally hearts of oak, broke, no money. Now, those are the long forms of rhyming slang. If you made it the short forms, it would come down to I don't Adam it. Went out get some uncle, a linen, and some oilies, which don't necessarily happen. So that's how rhyming slang works. If you'd like to read more about it, I do recommend that Lonely Planet British Phrase Book. Although it looks just like a little tourist book, it actually is full of very authentic information written by knowledgeable linguists. Just look briefly at your handout for some more things about Cockney. These are grammatical features which I say you also find in many other local varieties of English, local non-standard varieties. Multiple negation. Standard English, I haven't done anything. Non-standard English, I've never done nothing. Where you negate every word you can negate. So, haven't, ain't, haven't ever becomes haven't never, ain't never, haven't done anything becomes done nothing. Verb morphology, past tense, past participle of various irregular verbs, strong verbs. Standard English, you saw him, or you've seen him. Non-standard English, you've seen him, meaning simply you saw him. Standard answer, denying this, I didn't. Non-standard answer, I never. Never used as a negating particle. Standard past tense of the verb to do is did. They did it. Non-standard past tense, done. They done it. Verb to be, past tense, standard, I was, you were, he was. London, past tense, I was, you was, he was. Lancashire, past tense, where I come from, I were, you were, he were. So it could be either was or were, depending on the part of the country, but not with the standard switching between was and were by the different persons. Reflexive pronouns. I, myself, you, yourself, he, himself, she, herself, standard. Non-standard, it is self for himself. Themselves becomes their selves, and so on. It belongs to me, it's mine. It belongs to you, standard, it's yours. London, non-standard, belongs to me, it's mine. Belongs to you, it's yourn. Yourn, it's sort of logical. Mine, yourn, isn't. Belongs to him, it isn't. Demonstratives. This, that, these, those. Non-standard, not those books, but them books. Where do you get them books from? Them books on the table, yeah. Switching into Lancashire, them books on the table. It's Lancashire, them books on the table. Adverbs. Those of you who know German know that German adverbs don't have a special ending. They're like adjectives. English adverbs normally do have a special ending, ly, ly. Some exceptions, but in non-standard English, that ly ending is usually missing. So rather than trains are running normally, you might get trains are running normal. As the football manager says, not the boys did well, but the boys done good. Good for well. Special uses of prepositions: to go down the pub, standard English down to the pub, or to be down the pub, standard to be down at the pub. So where we have down to or down at, in standard English we can get just down in London English and some other places. Similarly, for up at or up to, you can get just up. Whereas Mary, she's up her nan's, meaning she's up at her grandmother's. Throw something standardly out of the window. Many kinds of non-standard English throw it out the window. You get this one in American English as well. Not in my English. There are some other non-standard forms here which bring us onto the edge of pronunciation. The ending, spelt ing, the verb ending, or the ending of various other words, as in running, evening, feeding, sealing, morning, and so on. Standard English has a velar nasal ing, but in non-standard English, almost everywhere in the English-speaking world has an alveolar nasal. So we have a non-standard form within. So running, evening, feeding or feeding, sealing, good morning. Non-standard, therefore, associated with social class, with working class rather than with middle class, upper class, and with informality, casual pronunciation rather than careful pronunciation. The sociolinguists have shown that we have a continuum in our population. We have a top layer who use the velar nasal all the time under all circumstances. I think I belong there. I always say running. I don't feel tempted or anything to say running. I have to make a special effort to say running. We've got a bottom layer of people who always use the alveolar nasal, running, evening. And we've got a rather broad intermediate band of people who switch according to the circumstances in which they find themselves, where they have a casual form, perhaps used among friends and so on, running, and a more careful or formal form, running. So one of the things about estuary English is probably going to be a tendency sometimes to use the alveolar rather than the velar nasal in words like this. The suffix thing is a bit different. This is what we have in words like something, anything, nothing, everything. And here, the standard pronunciation ends again in the velar nasal. In London, and the southeast in general, you quite often get an extra voiceless velar plosive, a K sound there. So you get something, something else, as against the standard something else. Nothing at all, rather than nothing at all. In London speech, in fact, something gets further reduced. You get pronunciations such as selling. In other parts of the country, you may get forms historically deriving from somewhat instead of from something. So pronounced summit, or in the north of England, summit. And where I grew up, the word for something was summit. Anything, likewise, standardly anything, or anything. Non-standardly in London, anything. Or with one of the features we shall see shortly, the TH fronting, anything. And in the north of England, oat, deriving from a different word from the word spelled O-U-G-H-T, ought. Isn't it? It's especially interesting. In the form of English we teach you, RP, we tell you that you can, if you like, elide the T, so rather than isn't it, you can also say isn't it. I dutifully teach you this because this is what Gimson taught. I must say that it doesn't come natively to me to leave the T out. I normally say isn't it, but maybe that's because I'm a northerner. Anyhow, lots of people say isn't it, and we reckon that's okay. What you also get though in London is in it, or in it, or in rather more careful Cockney, ain't it, which are often spelt differently in writing, shown as A-I-N-T, like that. Where I come from, it's ain't it, all of them meaning isn't it. And so we have these, again, regional and social variants of particular words. It's really quite difficult to sort out casual forms on the one hand from non-standard forms on the other hand. My rule of thumb for myself, being a public school boy and confident in my language, is if I use it myself, then it's casual RP, if I have any doubt about it. If I don't use it, then it's non-RP. But this is very arbitrary and obviously not a satisfactory criteria. Here's the kind of thing that I worry about, how to classify. The number 20. Now we know Americans say 20, but we're not Americans. I don't think I ever say 20, but I hear lots of people who do. There are lots of English people who at least sometimes say 20 rather than 20. And plenty rather than plenty. So it's perhaps an informal, casual variant on the verge of being non-standard. It's also probably regional because it's associated more with the southeast than with other parts. In fact, it's interesting to see what does apply in London with what I call NT reduction. Now, in American English, NT reduction applies whenever you have a word with NT in the relevant stress position. So if you have summer and winter, Americans can say summer and winter, or they can say summer and winter. They can lose the T there. And And they can do that for all the words like that. Centre becomes centre, and so on. In London, you can only do it with the words that you see on the screen there. Those are the only words in which NT is reduced to A. 20, plenty, want, well, past tense wanted, when it comes before a word beginning with a vowel, as I want it, I want it. And of course the reduction of want to into wanna, I want to break free. No prizes for recognising where the picture comes from. And likewise with went before a vowel, went away, went off. So that's NT reduction. What we're going to do now is look at various Cockney pronunciation features, some of which will apply more widely, others of which don't. H dropping means not pronouncing H. And this is found in working class, popular, English, almost everywhere in England. Not quite everywhere, but nearly everywhere. The only city of any size where you don't get this is Newcastle on Tyne. Otherwise, virtually throughout England, not in Scotland, not in Ireland. Wales is a bit variable. It just means you don't pronounce the H. So this is an hammer, not a hammer. There's its A. There's its angle. This is an R. If it's in London, it can be an Elfie R. This is also R. And they both sound the same. I have a gardener friend who, well, is he a Cockney? He grew up in Tooting in southwest London. He has a strong London accent, but this isn't the official Cockney area. But he often makes great jokes about a lady who told him to cut the edge, and so he cut the edge. But she meant the hedge, but he interpreted it as being the edge, because hedge and edge sound the same if you drop H's. As those of you who read Dickens will know, you also sometimes get hypercorrect insertion of H in words that shouldn't carry it in standard English. So, saying Heaster for Easter, that kind of thing. Get some more H dropping. And also, when you ask someone how they're doing, you say, how are you? How are you? How are you? Vowel weakening is an important feature of English. In particular, Cockney weakens unstressed O to in a way that doesn't happen in RP or other standard accents. So, for standard window, in Cockney you can get winder. For standard pillow, you can get pillar. And this means, indeed, that pillar is then ambiguous, as between a pillar that you put your head on, or a pillar, a column. Could both be the same. Again, you get hypercorrection, restoring O, not always in the right places, giving us the newspaper, the Daily Mirror, instead of the Daily Mirror. The most frequent place where you hear special weakening in Cockney, though, is with the weak forms of you and to. Now, in received pronunciation, in final position, end of a sentence, end of something else, you don't weaken these, or you don't weaken them very much. So to say goodbye in an informal way, you could say, see you, it's still you. In Cockney, it weakens to ya. And Cockney schwa is very open, so it becomes ya, see ya, see ya, see ya. Now there's a world of social difference in London between saying see ya and see you. See you is posh, see ya is vulgar. That's the difference. I say, how are you? Okay, our next thing is TH grunting. TH sounds, dental fricatives. Difficult sounds to make. Many learners of English as a foreign language have problems with the. So do children. lapse into adult life. English children have for many decades tended to say thing instead of thing. And now this is heard from adults as well in London, and it's spreading very fast to other parts of Britain. So instead of thing, you have thing. Instead of mouth, you have mouth, or with a London vowel, mouth. The corresponding voiced fricative, instead of mother, we have mother. Instead of father, we have father. Instead of brother, we have brother. Okay. There's a Cockney patter song by the comedian singers Chaz and Dave, where there's a nice rhyme saying, "Wouldn't you rather be on the Costa Brava?" 33 becomes 33, or with a London glottal T, 33. Well, that's easy to state and easy to imitate. When we have the at the beginning of a word, though, Londoners often don't do that. They don't say the, this and that, as you might expect. Rather, they use stopping. They turn it into a plosive. They say d, dis, dat. Or sometimes they assimilate it to the preceding word. So all this, double L, all that. Is and that, double N. Or you can indeed leave it out altogether and say is that, for this and that, which means the difference between the definite article and indefinite article becomes impossible to hear. Our next London pronunciation process is L vocalization. Now, we haven't yet talked about clear L and dark L, but some of you will know about this. When English L comes before a consonant, or at the end of a word, we make it in a special dark way, or it's this dark L that undergoes further change in London to become a kind of vowel sound. Rather than or, we get o. So for milk, we get milk, 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 where you don't use your tongue tip at all when saying milk, milk. It's just a new kind of diphthong, milk. You could try and imitate it if you like, milk, 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 milk. You may find it easier than saying milk. Well, there are millions of speakers of English who say milk. So if you find that easier, I don't see why you should too. The milk is in bottles, or in London pronunciation, bottles. Bottles, bottles. There for the syllabic dark all. Again, we've got a bottles. Here's a shell. That's a pencil. This is a well-known wall. Great Wall of China. Wall. All of these words show us vocalized L. A London feature, spreading, but not spreading quite so fast as TH fronted. Here's just a reminder about L sounds. There are 4 animals. Which of them would have dark L in received pronunciation and therefore vocalized L in London? Lion? No. That's a clear L because it's before a vowel. Lion. Antelope? No. Clear L because it's before a vowel. Elk? Yes. That's going to become elk. Camel? Yes. Camel, dark L, therefore camel. Camel. That brings us on to the next topic, which is T-glottalling. Making some T sounds at the glottis. The glottis is the space between your vocal folds in your larynx. A glottal stop is bringing them sharply together. If I say the vowel R and then interrupt it like this, R, those are glottal stops. Would you like to try and make some glottal stops? If we we try and lift something heavy, that's the glottal stop. You make a glottal stop to make your rib cage firm, to exert pressure against it. That's a glottal stop. And in London, it's used as a kind of T sound. So rather than football, you will tend to have football, 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 football. Try foot, foot. This is my foot. Yeah, foot, foot. In Cockney, you get this between vowels. So where I would say water, Cockney pronunciation can be water, 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 water. And there's the city, 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 city. Indeed, one of the lines on the London Underground is the Waterloo and City line. Well, these glottal stops are spreading very much in England, and indeed Scotland, and indeed Wales. Not as far as I know Ireland. They are most readily heard before a consonant. So that in a word like football, in fact I think it's frequently to be heard within received pronunciation nowadays. It's before vowels that it stands out as being not really a received pronunciation possibility. Though there too, it is spreading. So in a phrase like to get out, in my English I can't use glottal stops at all there, get out. If I were 30 years younger than I am, I'd probably be able to say get out. Get out, with the first one as glottal and the second one not. Though it would be an alternative probably to get out, which I can say in my informal English with T voicing, get out, get out. If I were a Londoner, I could probably make both of these glottal and say get out, get out. As it is, for me to make that is really quite an effort. I have to concentrate like on a foreign language, get out. And this brings us to another point. The glottal stop is becoming much more familiar to people, inasmuch as my students, when they haven't studied phonetics at all, and I ask them about it, they think it's much easier than a proper T sound. Indeed, when small children play and machine gun one another, when I machine gun somebody else, I would go da 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 like that. London children, I can't really do this, but London children do it with glottal stops. I can't do it at the proper speed because it's not familiar. Thank you, yes. Let's come and do it with the microphone. Okay. So see, I'm just too old to be able to do that properly. It does seem to be true that the glottal stop is seen as an easy sound, and it's therefore spreading very readily to replace T in these syllable final foot internal positions. Our next thing is yod dropping or yod coalescence. Yod is a name for the palatal semivowel, yeah. And there are two things that can happen to it in London. Either it can be lost, disappear, which can happen after N very readily, so new becomes new, neutral becomes neutral, new becomes new. Same thing, of course, happens in American English, so you may be familiar with it. And after T and D, you sometimes get this in London. So tune can become tune, reduce can become reduce. That's actually not as common in London as the other possibility, which is yod coalescence, where T and D plus yod coalesce into ch and j, so that my tune becomes London tune, my reduce becomes reduce. Yesterday was Tuesday, whereas for me it was Tuesday. And similarly with other words. So there's someone playing a tune or a tune, the Duke or Duke of Edinburgh, beginning is oo. Next sound change we got is diphthong shift. Various diphthongs, long vowels, undergo changes in the southeast of England and in London, which may make them quite difficult to understand at first. Certainly when I first came to live in London, I took a little time to adjust to all this. So, face, standard pronunciation, received pronunciation is face, face, face. Shifted, half of the way, it's demonstrating a shift, isn't it? Right. Shifted we get, first of all, face, face, face. Try imitating it, face, 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 face. Greater shift still, we get face, face, face. Wash your face. Face. That's the A vowel. Similarly, the I vowel is in price, undergoes a change, it becomes backer, so we get price, 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 or further still, it gets a bit of rounding, price, 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 price. So rather than face and price, we have face and price. Notice that the difference between them remains. They don't become identical. So you may have come across these jokes about London English, or the same thing happens in Australian English, so about Australians. Somebody wakes up in hospital, doesn't know where he is. Did I come into hospital to die? No, you're going to be quite all right. Confusion then of today and to die. Well, there may be phonetic overlap, but for any given speaker, the two sounds are different. Nobody actually confuses the sounds. Similarly, the oi diphthong remains different from that of price and so on. At least in London, it's not clear that it always does in Essex, which means that this in London is my tie, but something you play with is going to be a toy, toy. It's going to be different, toy. So London extreme, toy, toy. Received pronunciation, tie, toy. They're different. That's why we speak of a shift in these diphthongs, rather like the great vowel shift of 600 years ago. This is a new one. Well, there are a number of more technical changes listed on the handout. Other diphthong shifts, the vowel of goat, mouth, in London can be goat, rather wider, o, 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 o. So instead of Joan won't go home, Joan won't go home. Well, wider vowel, o. For ow, mouth, the very widespread pronunciation in the southeast of England involves the first element being like a. So ow. So rather than down and out, shall I say, you get down and out. Down, would you like to try saying that? Down and out. Down and out. Down and out. But in real Cockney, in broader speech, more locally marked speech, you get ow changing to ow, or indeed to ah. So instead of down, you get dan or dan. If you go and listen to the street traders selling fruit, they're supposed to sell it in kilos these days, but they still mostly sell it by the pound. So half a crown a pound was the traditional way of saying this, half a crown a pound. That's old money, so 30 years ago and more. Nowadays we don't have half a crown, but we do still have pound for a few more years yet. And it's pronounced pound by the street trader. Monophthongs e and oo can be rather diphthongal in London. E, oo. Indeed, we can sum up the things we've looked at so far by counting in Cockney, and you might like to count with me. Arc is rather open, so rather than one, we get one, right? One, Two, well, we get affrication of t becomes sort of t, not like in German. U becomes diphthongal u, so we get two. Three, diphthong e, th fronting to f gives us frey. So we've got 1, 2, frey. 1, 2, frey. Well, now the next number brings us on to the next point here. Corresponding to standard or, Londoners often have two different possible qualities. At the end of a word, it can be or. So 1, 2, 3, 4. That's rather broad Cockney. In less marked Cockney, it's nevertheless or, somewhat opener than what we get if there's a following consonant. On your handout, we've got the words lawn, morning, and board. In Cockney, these can be loan, loan, morning, bold. And that's different from law, scorn, bored when you're feeling fed up. And you see, in fact, there's a minimal pair there. Bold to write on, bored, fed up, which are both exactly the same in my speech, both are bored. Well, it's not really a phonemic contrast because it's predictable for the environment. The point about bored is that it's the past tense of born, so you sort of know there's a boundary there. Anyhow, if you ask English people you meet, do these two words bored sound the same or different? This is an extremely good diagnostic for sorting out Londoners from everybody else, people from the London area from everybody else, because everybody else will say they sound the same, Londoners will say they sound different. Another sort of split of phonemes applies with O, or its Londonarian O, because it has a special variety before dark L. Now, this is much more widespread than London. This is found in many other parts of the country as well. It means that in a word like goal, that you score at football, it's not O, but it's O. O. Goal. 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 Rather than my shoulder, that's what I say, shoulder. People who do this say shoulder. 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 And this goes together with the vocalization of L, swallowing the L, so you actually get shoulder with a new diphthong O, shoulder, which then doesn't rhyme with coda or soda. And so again, you get a nice test of this if you ask about the man who keeps goal, who is the goalie. Does this rhyme with the adverb from slow, which is then slowly? These words rhyme perfectly for me. Goalie, slowly. Goalie, slowly. For Londoners, they don't rhyme. Goalie, slowly. And for many other people, they don't rhyme. Which is why I did indicate this as a possibility in the London pronunciation dictionary. The last rule we're going to look at, this is very exciting for you because this is not found in any printed book anywhere. Here you can think of yourselves as being at the cutting edge of research. This is the process I call postglottal schwa deletion. Namely, when you have T pronounced as a glottal stop, and the next sound is schwa, then you can lose the schwa before a following consonant. Right? So rather than saying you've got to be joking, in London you get the glottal stop, you've got to be joking, you've got to be, as a schwa, you can lose it entirely, giving you've got to be joking. You've got to be, meaning got to be. What's the time? 3:15, with a glottal stop, 3:15. There's a schwa, 3:15. You bet be careful. You better be careful. You bet be careful. Seems to me it's a very productive rule. I haven't found any cases where you can't elide that schwa if those conditions are met. Even things like totally. I'm totally annoyed. Totally. Well, syllabic L. but underlying syllabic L is schwa plus L, so it comes from totally. What happens in London? Totally. Totally, totally, totally. 2 syllables. Totally. Sorry? Butter life. Butter knife. Butt knife. You need a butt knife. Butt knife. Don't feel happy with it? Okay. Well, here we are. This is live research taking place in front of your eyes, seeing what just the boundaries may be of this. I'm not a native speaker of London English, I'm not a native speaker of Estuary English, I'm an outside observer, so we do have to test these things out against people who grew up among it. Even those who come from Broadstairs or somewhere wherever it is. Ramsgate, sorry.
Ramsgate.
Ramsgate. Okay, from the southeast of England. I finish off with a nice diagram I've made you. If we have to have this term estuary, as we probably do, this lists a sort of checklist of some of the diagnostic features here. So H dropping is Cockney. My definition of estuary English is that it's standard English pronounced with a southeastern accent. So it's not got all these non-standard, uneducated grammar things that you get in Cockney. It's educated English, but nevertheless has this sound of the southeast of England. So no H dropping in estuary, and of course no H dropping in R. TH fronting, yes in Cockney. It's difficult to say about estuary. I tended originally to say no, you can't have it in estuary English because it's not standard. But the research is carried out by these assiduous Europeans who've been doing theses on the subject show that the kinds of people we probably want to say speak estuary English do quite often do TH fronting. So I put plus minus in there, not in received pronunciation. L vocalization, yes in Cockney, yes in estuary. Well, sometimes even in RP, Gimson gives 1 or 2 examples, myself, table, which he reckons are okay in RP, not in my speech, but for some people, yes. Tja, going to ch, beyond coalescence, before a stressed vowel, yes in Cockney, yes in estuary. It seems to be happening in young RP as well, because certainly pronunciations like tune do seem to be coming in, not for my generation, but for people 30, 40 years younger than me. T-glottalling, before a vowel, get off and so on, yes in Cockney, yes in estuary, beginning to be heard across a word boundary. In RP, quite easy, get off and so on. Again, not for my age group, so I give it a plus minus to show it is variable. Okay, that's it. There are some sort of books you can have a look at on the table here, or on the table. Yes.